The flour dust hung so thick in the air that Josiah Quinn couldn't see 3 feet in front of him as he pushed through the door of Samuel's mill. But what he heard made him freeze in his tracks: a woman's laughter, bright and musical, cutting through the rhythmic grinding of the millstones like sunshine through storm clouds. "Papa, I told you not to overfill the hopper again," came that voice, still touched with mirth despite the exasperation in her words. Josiah blinked against the white powder settling on his eyelashes, his chest tight from the long ride down from the mountains with pelts to trade. He had been 3 months in the high country this time, longer than usual, and the civilization of Deer Lodge, Montana, felt strange and cramped after the vast wilderness. It was late summer in 1876, and the mountain man had planned to conduct his business quickly and return to the solitude he craved. But then the flour cloud began to settle and he saw her. She stood beside the great millstone, absolutely covered from head to toe in white flour. It dusted her dark hair until it looked silver, coated her simple cotton dress, and even powdered her eyelashes. But her face was turned upward, catching a beam of afternoon sunlight streaming through the high window, and she was laughing still, brushing ineffectually at the powder on her apron. The light made the flour sparkle like snow crystals, and for a moment Josiah forgot how to breathe. "She's the miller's daughter covered in flour," he said aloud without meaning to, his deep voice rumbling through the mill like distant thunder. Then, softer but no less sincere, "She looks like an angel to me." The young woman's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with surprise. They were the color of honey, warm and golden even through the white dust. An older man emerged from behind the millstone, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already saturated with flour. "Can I help you, stranger?" the miller asked, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. He was a solid man with graying hair and the careful posture of someone whose back had seen decades of hard labor. Josiah removed his worn leather hat, suddenly conscious of his appearance. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and arms thick with muscle from years of trapping, hunting, and surviving in the unforgiving mountain wilderness. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of rawhide, and his beard was full but neatly trimmed. His buckskin clothes were well worn but clean, decorated with fringe and beadwork he'd traded for with the Salish people who lived in the high valleys. "I've got flour sacks that need filling," Josiah said, finding his voice again though his eyes kept drifting back to the young woman. "6 of them if you've got the supply, and cornmeal too, 2 sacks. "We can do that," the miller said, relaxing slightly. "Julia, fetch the measuring scoops, would you, Julia?" Her name was Julia. Josiah turned it over in his mind like a smooth river stone. "Yes, Papa," she said, and her voice had a slight tremor that made Josiah wonder if she had heard what he'd said about angels. She disappeared through a doorway, leaving a small cloud of flour in her wake. "You're one of the mountain men," the miller observed, moving to where empty sacks hung from hooks on the wall. "We don't see many of your kind this late in the season. Most come through in spring with their winter catch." "Stayed longer than I meant to," Josiah admitted, setting his own empty sacks on the counter. "The trapping was good and I had no reason to hurry back." "Until now," whispered a traitorous voice in the back of his mind. Julia returned with the measuring equipment, and Josiah noticed she had made an attempt to brush some of the flour from her hair and face, though it was largely unsuccessful. Pink colored her cheeks, and she kept her eyes downcast as she began measuring grain into his sacks with practiced efficiency. "I'm Samuel Sinclair," the miller offered, extending a flour-dusted hand. "This is my daughter, Julia. We've been running this mill for 8 years now since we came out from Ohio." Josiah shook the man's hand firmly. "Josiah Quinn. I've got a cabin up in the high country near Flint Creek. Been trapping these mountains for near about 12 years. 12 years, Samuel repeated with respect. That's a long time to survive alone in the wilderness. It suits me, Josiah said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt less true than they had that morning. He watched Julia work, noting the careful precision of her movements, the way she bit her lower lip slightly when concentrating. Flour still dusted her like fresh snow, and he had to resist the urge to reach out and brush it from her cheek. "There's talk of Indian troubles up in the high country," Samuel said, his voice dropping slightly. "After what happened with Custer and the 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn back in June, folks are nervous. You've been all right up there. The Salish and Kootenai peoples in these parts aren't looking for war," Josiah said carefully. "They've got their own concerns, and most are trying to avoid the conflicts happening further east. I trade with them fairly, respect their land and customs. Never had trouble." Julia looked up at that, meeting his eyes for the first time since her father had introduced them. "That must be lonely, though," she said quietly, "being so far from other people." Josiah found himself caught in that honey-colored gaze. "I've always thought it was peaceful," he said, "but maybe I just hadn't found a reason to feel lonely yet." Color bloomed in her cheeks again, visible even under the flour dust, and a small smile touched her lips before she looked back down at her work. Samuel glanced between them with the knowing look of a father who recognizes when his daughter has caught someone's attention. "Julia's been a blessing here at the mill," Samuel said pointedly. "Don't know what I'd do without her. She's got a gift for figures, keeps all our accounts, and she can fix the machinery when it acts up better than I can sometimes." Pride rang clear in his voice, and Julia's smile grew even as she shook her head at the praise. "Papa exaggerates," she said. "I just pay attention to the sounds the mill makes. You can tell when something's going wrong if you listen carefully." "That's a rare skill," Josiah said honestly. "Most people don't take the time to really listen." "What do you listen to in the mountains?" Julia asked, looking up at him again with genuine curiosity. "Everything," Josiah said, leaning against the counter. "The wind tells you when weather's coming. The birds warn you about predators. The way water sounds in the creeks can tell you if there's been rain upstream. Even the silence has different qualities. The silence before a storm feels different from the silence of deep winter." Julia's face had lit up with interest, her hand stilling on the flour scoop. "I never thought about it that way, but it makes perfect sense. It's like how the mill sounds different when the grain is too dry versus too damp. The stones sing a different song." "Exactly like that," Josiah said, pleased that she understood. Most people looked at him strangely when he tried to explain such things. Samuel cleared his throat, though there was amusement in his eyes. "Those sacks are about full, Julia. Why don't you tally up the cost while I help Mr. Quinn load them?" The next 20 minutes passed in the practical business of loading supplies, but Josiah found his attention divided. Half his mind was on the weight of the sacks and securing them properly, but the other half was acutely aware of Julia at the counter. Her head bent over a ledger as she recorded the transaction in neat, flowing script. When she calculated his total, she did it without hesitation, her mind quick with numbers just as her father had said. "That comes to $8.40, she said, looking up at him with those remarkable eyes. Some of the flour had finally begun to settle out of her hair, revealing dark brown waves that framed her face. Josiah counted out the money, making sure to include an extra $1. "For the trouble of the flour explosion," he said when Julia tried to give back the change. "That wasn't your trouble, it was ours," Julia protested, but Samuel waved her objection away. "Take it as a tip for good service," the miller said. "Julia's too modest to accept compliments, but she's earned it. Josiah should have left then. His supplies were loaded, his business concluded." But his feet seemed rooted to the floor of the mill, reluctant to walk away from the young woman who had transformed an ordinary errand into something that felt significant in ways he couldn't quite name. "You come to town often?" Julia asked, and there was a hopeful note in her voice that made Josiah's heart beat faster. "Not as often as I probably should," he admitted. "Every few months, usually, for supplies and to trade my pelts." "The trading post gives the best prices on Saturdays," Julia offered. "If you're planning to sell. Mr. Henderson brings his scales in from the ranch, and they're certified by the territorial office." "I appreciate the advice," Josiah said, recognizing the information for what it was, a reason for him to stay in town a few more days. "I was planning to head back up the mountain tomorrow, but maybe I'll wait until after Saturday." Julia's smile was like sunrise over the mountain peaks, warm and full of promise. "We're open every day except Sunday," she said, "if you need anything else." Samuel made a noise that might have been a cough or might have been a suppressed laugh. Josiah found himself grinning despite his usual serious demeanor. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Thank you both for your help." He made himself walk toward the door, but paused with his hand on the frame and looked back. Julia was watching him, flour still dusting her like snow, and the afternoon light streaming through the window made her glow like she was lit from within. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the mill floor, "would it be all right if I came by tomorrow to make sure the flour's settling properly in the sacks? Sometimes it needs to be redistributed." It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. Flour didn't need checking like that. But Julia's smile widened, and her father's expression was knowing but not unkind. "That would be very conscientious of you, Mr. Quinn," Julia said, and there was laughter in her voice, warm and musical. "We'd be happy to help with any adjustments you might need." Josiah nodded, not trusting himself to say more without making a fool of himself, and stepped out into the Montana afternoon. The street was quiet, just a few people going about their business in the small mountain town. Deer Lodge had perhaps 500 souls, enough to support a general store, a trading post, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of other necessary establishments. It was nestled in a valley with mountains rising on all sides, the kind of place that could feel either cozy or claustrophobic, depending on your temperament. Josiah had always found it claustrophobic before. But as he walked toward the boarding house where he'd arranged a room, the town felt different. Smaller, yes, but in a way that felt intimate rather than confining. He could see the whole of Main Street from where he stood, could trace the path from the boarding house to the mill in his mind's eye. He shook his head at himself, half amused and half alarmed at the direction of his thoughts. One conversation with a pretty woman, and he was already reorganizing his mental map of the town around her. He'd spent 12 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, valuing his freedom and solitude above all else. But as he settled into his room and lay on the bed that felt too soft after months on the ground or in his cabin's rough bunk, he couldn't get Julia Sinclair out of his mind. The way her laugh had sounded, bright and unself-conscious despite being covered in flour. The intelligence in her eyes when she'd talked about listening to the mill's sounds. The quick competence of her hands and mind as she'd measured and calculated. "She looks like an angel to me," he'd said, and he'd meant it. Not just because of the flour dust making her glow in the sunlight, though that had been what prompted the words. But because there had been something luminous about her, a quality of warmth and genuine kindness that had reached into the careful walls he'd built around his heart and found the cracks. He was in trouble, and he knew it. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Josiah found himself taking more care with his appearance than he had in years. He washed in the basin provided by the boarding house, combed his hair and re-tied it neatly, and even trimmed his beard slightly. His buckskin clothes were the same as yesterday. He owned nothing else, but he brushed them clean and made sure the fringe hung straight. Mrs. Cooper, who ran the boarding house, gave him a knowing look when he came down for breakfast. She was a widow in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, but a kind heart underneath. "The mill doesn't open until 8, she said as she set a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of him. "You've got an hour yet." Josiah felt heat climb up the back of his neck. "I've got business in town," he said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. "I'm sure you do," Mrs. Cooper said, her tone dry but not unkind. "Julia Sinclair is a lovely girl. Her mother died when they first came to Deer Lodge. Consumption took her that first winter. Samuel's raised that girl on his own, and he's done a fine job of it. She's smart, kind, and hardworking. Half the young men in town have tried to court her, but she's turned them all down." Josiah absorbed this information, trying not to show how much it interested him. "Why's that?" "She's particular," Mrs. Cooper said, refilling his coffee. "Said she's not interested in marrying just to have a husband. Wants something more, though she's not quite sure what that is. Samuel doesn't push her, though I know he worries about what will happen to her when he's gone. He's got a weak heart, though he doesn't talk about it much." "How weak?" Josiah asked, his mind immediately jumping to practical concerns. "Weak enough that folks worry," Mrs. Cooper said. "He gets spells where he can't catch his breath and his color goes bad. Doc says he needs to take it easy, but you try telling a miller to slow down when there's grain to grind and bills to pay." Josiah finished his breakfast slowly, thinking. When the clock in the boarding house parlor finally chimed 8, he made his way back to the mill, his long stride eating up the distance quickly. Samuel was already at work, the great millstone turning with its familiar grinding rhythm. Julia was at a table near the front, doing what looked like accounting work, her dark hair tied back with a blue ribbon that matched her dress. She'd clearly bathed since yesterday, no longer covered in flour, and Josiah felt a pang of almost disappointment before recognizing how foolish that was. She looked up when the door opened and her face brightened when she saw him. "Mr. Quinn, good morning." "Miss Sinclair," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she assured him, setting down her pen. "Did you want to check on those flour sacks?" There was a teasing note in her voice, an acknowledgement that they both knew he had no real need to check on them. Josiah found himself grinning in response to her gentle mockery. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be free to take a walk," he said, the words coming out more easily than he'd expected. "If your father can spare you and if you'd be interested." Julia glanced toward the back of the mill where Samuel was working. "Papa," she called. Samuel emerged, dusting his hands on his apron, and looked between them with an expression that was hard to read. After a long moment, he nodded. "Mind you're back by noon," he said to Julia. "We've got the Henderson order to fill this afternoon." "I'll have her back with time to spare," Josiah promised, and meant it. Julia removed her apron and collected a shawl from a hook near the door, though the morning was already warm enough that she probably wouldn't need it. They stepped out into the sunshine, and for a moment neither of them seemed quite sure where to go. "There's a path along the creek," Julia offered. "It's pleasant in the morning before the day gets too hot." They walked in companionable silence at first, leaving the main street behind for a narrow trail that followed Deer Lodge Creek as it wound through stands of cottonwood and willow. The water was running low this late in the summer, gurgling peacefully over smooth stones. Birds sang in the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a tree. "You were right about the sounds," Julia said after a while. "I've been paying attention since you mentioned it yesterday. The creek does sound different here where it's shallow versus back near the mill where it runs deeper." "What else do you hear?" Josiah asked, pleased. Julia paused, tilting her head to listen. "The cottonwood leaves sound like rain when the wind moves through them. The willows are quieter, more of a whisper, and there's something else, a sort of humming sound." "What is that?" "Insects," Josiah said. "Bees and other pollinators working the flowers. It's one of the sounds of summer. In another month it'll be quieter as things start to prepare for winter." They continued walking, and gradually Julia began to ask questions about his life in the mountains. Josiah found himself talking more than he had in years, describing the rhythm of the seasons in the high country, the challenges and rewards of living so close to the land. He told her about the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the root cellar where he stored his supplies, the smoke house for preserving meat. "It sounds lonely," Julia said, not for the first time, but now there was more understanding in her voice. "But also beautiful. I think I see why you stay." "Why did you come west?" Josiah asked in turn. "Mrs. Cooper said you were from Ohio originally." Pain flickered across Julia's face, quickly suppressed. "My mother had consumption. The doctor said the dry air out here might help her, so Papa sold everything we had and brought us west. We'd been here 3 months when she died anyway. That first winter was so cold and she was already so weak." "I'm sorry," Josiah said quietly. "It was 8 years ago," Julia said. "I was 14. Old enough to understand that we'd tried everything we could, but young enough to still be angry at God for taking her anyway." "Are you still angry?" Julia considered the question seriously. "Not anymore, or at least not as much. I've had time to make peace with it, and Papa needed me to be strong. The mill was struggling, we barely had enough money to survive, and he was grieving so hard I thought he might follow Mama into the grave. So I learned the business, took over the books, did whatever needed doing. We made it work." There was steel underneath Julia's gentle exterior, Josiah realized. The kind of strength that came from facing hardship and refusing to break. It was a quality he recognized, one that he valued highly. "You were young to carry that much responsibility," he said. "So were you," Julia countered. "Mrs. Cooper told me you came west when you were 16 after your parents died of fever. You've been taking care of yourself ever since." Josiah smiled slightly. "Mrs. Cooper has a loose tongue." "She means well," Julia said, defending the older woman. "And she's not wrong, is she?" "No, she's not wrong," Josiah admitted. "My parents died within a week of each other. I had 2 younger sisters, but my uncle took them in. He didn't want me, said I was nearly grown and could make my own way. So I came west, figured I'd try my hand at trapping. Met an old mountain man named Gideon who taught me what I needed to know to survive. He died 5 years back, caught pneumonia after falling through ice." "I'm sorry," Julia said, echoing his earlier condolence. "It must have been hard losing your teacher." "It was," Josiah said. "But he taught me well. I knew how to survive, how to read the land and the weather, and I'd learned to be alone." They had reached a bend in the creek where a large flat rock provided a natural seat. Without discussing it, they both sat down, close enough that Josiah could smell the faint scent of soap and flour that clung to Julia's hair. "Why did you stay alone?" Julia asked softly. "In 12 years, you never wanted to come back to civilization, find a wife, have a family." Josiah picked up a smooth pebble and turned it over in his large hands. "I told myself I preferred solitude, that I was too set in my ways, too rough for polite company, that no woman would want the kind of life I could offer." "But," Julia prompted when he fell silent. But the truth is probably more complicated, Josiah said, meeting her eyes. I think I was afraid of letting someone close enough to lose them. I'd already lost my parents, lost Gideon. It seemed safer to keep to myself. And now, Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I'm wondering if I've been a fool, Josiah said honestly. Because yesterday I walked into your father's mill, and I saw you covered in flour, laughing in the sunlight, and something in my chest just cracked wide open. And I thought, maybe this is what I've been afraid of. Because you're the miller's daughter, and I'm just a mountain man who lives in the wilderness, and I've got no business thinking about you the way I'm thinking about you. Julia's breath had quickened, her cheeks flushing pink. How are you thinking about me? Josiah set down the pebble carefully. I'm thinking that I've never met anyone who made me want to reconsider everything I thought I knew about myself. I'm thinking that your laugh sounds like the best music I've ever heard. I'm thinking that I'd like to know everything about you, every thought in your head, every dream you've ever had. And I'm thinking that's too much to be feeling after knowing someone for a day, so I'm probably scaring you half to death right now. Julia was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the emotion Josiah could see in her eyes. You're not scaring me, she said. Or maybe you are a little, but not in a bad way. I've turned down every man in Deer Lodge who's tried to court me because none of them ever looked at me the way you do. They saw the miller's daughter, a useful wife who could keep books and wouldn't cost too much to keep. But you look at me like I'm someone worth knowing, not just someone worth having. You are worth knowing, Josiah said with absolute conviction. And having too if you'd ever want to be had by someone like me, but the knowing comes first. A smile tugged at Julia's lips. I'd like that. The knowing, I mean, though I won't rule out the rest if the knowing goes well. Josiah felt something in his chest expand, warm and hopeful in a way he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. I'm supposed to stay until Saturday to trade my pelts, he said. And I could probably find reasons to stay a few days longer after that, if you'd be willing to spend some time with me. Get to know each other better. I'd like that very much, Julia said, and the happiness in her eyes made Josiah want to move mountains if she asked. They sat by the creek for another hour, talking about everything and nothing. Julia told him about her dreams of traveling someday, seeing places beyond the mountains that surrounded Deer Lodge. Josiah described the wonders of the high country in different seasons. The alpine meadows full of wildflowers in spring, the autumn when the aspens turned gold like rivers of sunshine flowing down the mountainsides. When they finally walked back to the mill, Josiah felt like he was seeing the world through new eyes. Colors seemed brighter, sounds richer, the very air more vital. At the mill door, Julia paused and looked up at him. Thank you for the walk, she said, and for the conversation. It's been a long time since I talked to someone who really listened. Thank you for giving me a chance, Josiah replied. When can I see you again? Come by after we close today, Julia suggested. We usually finish around 6. Papa and I take our supper at Mrs. Chen's restaurant. You could join us, if you'd like. I'd like that very much, Josiah said. He spent the rest of the day in a state of pleasant distraction, wandering the town and making the acquaintance of various residents. He visited the trading post and made arrangements to bring in his pelts on Saturday. He stopped by the blacksmith to get a buckle repaired on his saddle bags. He even sat in on a checker game at the general store, though he paid more attention to the movement of the sun across the sky than to the game itself. When 6 o'clock finally arrived, he was waiting outside the mill, cleaned up and as presentable as a mountain man could reasonably be. Samuel and Julia emerged together, both dusty from the day's work but in good spirits. Samuel gave Josiah a long, measuring look before nodding slightly. "Mr. Quinn, Julia tells me you'll be joining us for supper. If that's all right with you, sir," Josiah said respectfully. "Suppose I don't have much say in it either way," Samuel said, but there was dry humor in his voice rather than hostility. "Come on then, Mrs. Chen makes the best dumplings in Montana, and I'm hungry enough to eat a horse." Mrs. Chen's restaurant was a small establishment run by a Chinese family who had settled in Deer Lodge after working on the railroad. The food was a mixture of traditional Chinese dishes and adaptations for local tastes. And as Samuel had promised, it was excellent. Over plates of dumplings, noodles, and stir-fried vegetables, the three of them fell into easy conversation. Samuel asked Josiah about his trapping, showing a genuine interest in the practical details. How did he preserve his food for the winter? What did he do when he got injured or sick? How did he manage to survive winters that could see temperatures drop to 40 below? Josiah answered honestly, not sugar-coating the difficulties, but also conveying his deep love for the life he'd built. As he talked, he watched Samuel's expressions, trying to understand the man's thoughts about his daughter spending time with a mountain man. "You've built a good life for yourself," Samuel said finally. "Independent, self-sufficient, I respect that, but it's a hard life and a lonely one. Not many women would take to it." "Papa," Julia said warningly, color rising in her cheeks. "It's a fair point," Josiah said, meeting Samuel's eyes steadily. "And I won't pretend I've thought through all the implications of my interest in your daughter. I'm still figuring out what I'm feeling, and I imagine she is too. But I can promise you this. I have the greatest respect for Julia, and I won't do anything to hurt her or compromise her reputation." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Just remember I've got a shotgun at the mill, and I'm still a good shot despite my age." "Papa!" Julia exclaimed, mortified, but Samuel was grinning. "Just making sure we understand each other," the miller said, taking a bite of his dumpling. After supper, Josiah walked them back to the mill. The family quarters were attached to the building, a small but comfortable home that Samuel and Julia had built up over the years. At the door, Julia lingered while her father went inside, giving them a moment of privacy. "I'm sorry about Papa," she said. "He's just protective." "He loves you," Josiah said simply. "I'd be more concerned if he wasn't protective. A father should look out for his daughter." Julia smiled up at him, and in the fading evening light she looked so lovely that Josiah's breath caught. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked. "If you want to," Josiah said. "I want to," Julia confirmed. "Maybe you could come by in the afternoon. We're usually less busy then, and Papa sometimes takes a rest. We could talk more." "I'll be here," Josiah promised. He walked back to the boarding house feeling like he was floating 6 inches off the ground. Mrs. Cooper took one look at his face and laughed. "Well, you've got it bad," she said. "Poor man. Once it hits you mountain men, you fall harder than anyone." Josiah couldn't even bring himself to deny it. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt both strange and wonderful to Josiah. Each morning he'd wake in the too-soft bed at the boarding house, take breakfast while Mrs. Cooper made knowing comments, and then find reasons to be near the mill. Sometimes he'd help Samuel with heavy lifting, using his considerable strength to move sacks of grain or adjust machinery. Sometimes he'd simply sit with Julia while she worked on the accounts, content to watch her neat handwriting fill the ledger pages. In the afternoons, when business was slow, they would walk together. Sometimes along the creek, sometimes through the town, sometimes out into the surrounding hills where the views opened up to show the full majesty of the Montana mountains. They talked endlessly, discovering each other's thoughts and feelings, sharing stories from their pasts and hopes for their futures. Josiah learned that Julia loved to read but had limited access to books. He learned that she'd taught herself to play the piano on the old instrument in the church, practicing when no one else was around, because she was self-conscious about her lack of formal training. He learned that she'd once wanted to be a teacher but had given up that dream to help her father with the mill. Julia learned that Josiah could identify every bird by its call, every tree by its bark, every track in the mud. She learned that he'd read more than she would have guessed, carrying a small collection of books in his cabin and rereading them through the long winter nights. She learned that beneath his rough exterior was a thoughtful, intelligent man with a poet's soul and a philosopher's questions about the world. On Saturday, Josiah sold his pelts at the trading post, getting good prices just as Julia had predicted. He found himself thinking about the money differently than he usually did. Instead of just seeing it as supplies for his next season in the mountains, he found himself wondering what Julia might need, what would make her life easier or happier. That evening, he bought a small package at the general store and presented it to Julia after supper. She unwrapped it to find 3 books, novels he'd selected with the help of the storekeeper's wife, who knew Julia's tastes. "Josiah, you shouldn't have," Julia said, but her eyes were shining as she looked through the titles. "These are wonderful." "I wanted to," Josiah said simply. "You should have more things that bring you joy." Julia looked up at him, her expression soft and tender. "You bring me joy," she said quietly. They were standing outside the mill in the gathering dusk, close enough that Josiah could have easily pulled her into his arms. He wanted to kiss her more than he'd ever wanted anything, wanted to feel the softness of her lips against his, wanted to show her through touch what he was feeling. But he'd promised Samuel that he'd respect Julia, so he simply reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You bring me joy too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I knew I could feel." Sunday they attended church together, sitting with Samuel in the pew where the Sinclairs usually sat. The whole town noticed, and Josiah could feel the weight of curious stares. After the service, several townspeople approached them, some friendly, some more reserved. Josiah understood the reserve. He was an outsider, a mountain man courting one of their own. They wanted to make sure he was serious, that he wouldn't break Julia's heart and disappear back into the wilderness. Mrs. Henderson, wife of the rancher who supplied the certified scales, pulled Julia aside for a whispered conversation. Josiah watched Julia's expressions change from surprise to embarrassment to laughter, and wondered what was being said. When Julia returned to his side, her cheeks were pink, but she was smiling. "Mrs. Henderson wanted to make sure you were aware that I can't cook very well," Julia reported. "Apparently it's her duty as a concerned citizen to warn you of my deficiencies as a potential wife." Josiah couldn't help but laugh at the blunt practicality of frontier women. "I've been cooking for myself for 12 years," he said. "I think I can manage." "She also wanted to know your intentions," Julia added more quietly. Josiah sobered, aware that this was an important moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was none of her business and that we're still getting to know each other," Julia said. "But I think you should know that the whole town is watching us. They're making assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" Josiah asked, though he had a good idea. "That you're courting me with the intention of proposing," Julia said, meeting his eyes directly. "That I'll either become a mountain man's wife or you'll give up the mountains to stay here. They're already taking bets on which it will be." Josiah felt his jaw tighten at the idea of people betting on their lives like it was a horse race, but he forced himself to relax. This was life in a small town. Everyone knew everyone else's business and they cared about their own. "Does it bother you?" he asked Julia. "The attention, the assumptions." "A little," Julia admitted. But mostly I just wish they'd let us figure things out at our own pace. We've known each other for less than a week, Josiah. Even if I'm feeling things I've never felt before, even if I think about you constantly, even if I'm already halfway in love with you, it seems too fast to be making life-changing decisions. Josiah's heart had started racing at her words, particularly at that phrase, halfway in love with you. He took her hand, not caring who was watching, and laced his fingers through hers. I'm feeling the same things, he said. And you're right, it's too fast. But I also know that what I feel is real. I'm not going anywhere until we've had time to figure out what this is and where it's going. Relief and happiness washed over Julia's face. How long can you stay? She asked. As long as you need me to, Josiah said, and meant it. The next 2 weeks were the happiest Josiah had ever known. He'd sent word back to his cabin through a passing trapper that he wouldn't be returning for a while, asking the man to check that everything was secure and to leave a note warning off anyone who might be thinking of squatting there. Then he'd settled into life in Deer Lodge as much as a man like him could. He helped Samuel at the mill regularly now, and the older man seemed to appreciate both the assistance and the company. Samuel's heart troubles were more serious than he'd let on, and Josiah often saw him stop work to catch his breath, his hand pressed to his chest. During those times, Josiah would quietly take over whatever Samuel had been doing, allowing the older man to rest without making a show of it. Julia bloomed under their courtship, her natural warmth and intelligence shining brighter than ever. She laughed more, sang while she worked, and looked at Josiah with such transparent affection that it made his chest tight. They stole moments alone whenever they could, walking, talking, gradually building a foundation of understanding and trust. On a Thursday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after Josiah had first walked into the mill, Samuel called him aside while Julia was making a delivery to the general store. "We need to talk, you and I," Samuel said, gesturing for Josiah to follow him to the small office where the business records were kept. He closed the door and sat down heavily in his chair, and Josiah could see the gray tinge to his skin that spoke of pain or exhaustion. "Are you all right?" Josiah asked, concerned. "No," Samuel said bluntly, "but that's part of what we need to talk about. Josiah, I'm dying. My heart is giving out and the doctor says I've got maybe a year, probably less. Julia doesn't know how serious it is. She knows I have a weak heart, but she doesn't know that it's failing." Josiah felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Have you told her the truth?" "No, and I'm not going to," Samuel said firmly. "Not yet, anyway. She'll fuss and worry and try to wrap me in cotton wool, and I want to spend what time I have left living normally. But I need to know that someone else understands the situation, someone who'll look after her when I'm gone." "Samuel," Josiah began, but the older man held up his hand. "Let me finish. I've watched you with my daughter these past weeks. I've seen how you look at her, how gentle you are with her, how you listen when she talks. I've also watched how you work, how you treat people, the kind of man you are. You're rough around the edges, Josiah Quinn, but you've got a good heart and strong principles. More importantly, Julia loves you. She hasn't said it yet, but a father knows. And I think you love her too." "I do," Josiah said without hesitation. "More than I thought I could love anyone." "Then I need you to understand what you're taking on," Samuel said. "The mill brings in enough money to live on, but there's a mortgage on it. 5 more years of payments. Julia knows the business inside and out, but she can't run it alone. The physical work is too much for one person, especially a woman. If something happens to me, she'll need help keeping it going, or she'll need to sell it, and selling will leave her with almost nothing after the mortgage is paid off." Josiah was already thinking through the problem, his mind turning over options and possibilities. What if someone ran it with her, a partner? That's what I'm hoping for, Samuel said, meeting his eyes directly. I'm hoping that you'll marry my daughter, help her run this mill, and make a life with her here in Deer Lodge. I know that's asking you to give up the mountains, give up the life you've built. I know it's not fair. But I'm a dying man asking you to take care of the person I love most in the world, and I'm not above using that for leverage. Josiah sat back, his mind racing. Give up the mountains. Give up trapping, give up his cabin, give up the life he'd built for 12 years. Stay in town, work at a mill, become a civilized man. A month ago, even a week ago, the thought would have been unthinkable. But now, looking at Samuel's desperate, hopeful expression, thinking about Julia and her laughter and her honey-colored eyes, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a choice. More than that, it felt like the right choice. I'd need to learn the business properly, Josiah said slowly. I can do the physical work, but I'd need Julia to teach me the rest. How long do we have? Relief flooded Samuel's face. You'll do it. You'll stay. I'll stay, Josiah confirmed. I'll marry Julia if she'll have me. I'll learn to run the mill, and I'll make sure she's taken care of, Samuel. You have my word on that. Samuel's eyes were wet with tears. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. Thank you. I can die easy knowing she won't be alone. You're not dying yet, Josiah said firmly. We've got time to teach me what I need to know, and you're going to be around to see your grandchildren. Do you understand me? You've got things to live for still. Samuel managed a weak laugh. I'll do my best. But Josiah, you need to propose to her properly. Don't tell her about my heart, not yet. Let her say yes because she wants to marry you, not because she thinks she needs to for security. She's proud, my Julia. She wouldn't want pity mixed up in it. I understand, Josiah said. And I'll tell you right now, there's no pity involved. I want to marry her because I love her, because I can't imagine my life without her anymore. The mill is just details. We'll figure that out. They shook hands on it, a pact between two men who both loved Julia in different ways. When Julia returned from her errand, she found them talking about grain suppliers and grinding schedules, teaching Josiah the basics of the business. If she thought it was odd that Josiah was suddenly so interested in the mill operations, she didn't say anything. She just smiled and joined the conversation, clearly pleased to have him taking an interest in her work. That evening, Josiah asked Julia to take a walk with him up into the hills above town. They climbed to a spot where the view opened up, showing Deer Lodge spread out below them in the valley, and the mountains rising all around like cathedral walls. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and the first stars were beginning to appear. This is beautiful, Julia said, standing close to Josiah's side. I've never been up here at this time of day. I wanted to find the right place, Josiah said. His heart was pounding so hard he was surprised she couldn't hear it. Julia, I need to talk to you about something important. She turned to face him, her expression curious and slightly concerned. That sounds serious. It is serious, Josiah said. He took her hands in his, marveling as always at how small and soft they were compared to his own work-roughened hands. 3 weeks ago, I walked into your father's mill expecting nothing more than to buy some flour. I saw you covered in white dust, laughing in the sunlight, and my whole world shifted on its axis. Julia's breath had quickened, her eyes wide and locked on his face. I've spent 12 years alone in the mountains, Josiah continued. I thought I wanted solitude, thought I'd built a good life for myself. And maybe I had built a good life, but it wasn't a full life. I didn't know that until I met you. You've shown me what I was missing, Julia. You've shown me that there's something better than being self-sufficient and alone. There's being together, sharing life with someone who makes everything brighter and richer and more meaningful. Josiah, Julia whispered, and there were tears starting to gather in her eyes. "I know it's fast," Josiah said. "I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I also know that what I feel is real and true and lasting. I love you, Julia Sinclair. I love your laugh and your intelligence and your strength. I love how you listen to the world around you. I love how you care for your father and how you've made a place for yourself in this town. I love who I am when I'm with you. You make me want to be better, do better, build something lasting." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands, and Julia made a small sound that was half gasp, half sob. "I don't have a ring yet," Josiah admitted. "I wanted to ask you first, make sure you'd say yes before I presumed. But Julia, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and cherish you and stand by your side for whatever comes? I know I'm asking you to marry a mountain man without much to his name. I know I'm rough and uncivilized, but I swear to you I'll spend every day trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" Julia was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too, a smile so radiant it rivaled the sunset. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Josiah, I'll marry you. I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. Yes." Josiah surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She was so small compared to him, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but she fit against him perfectly. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, feeling the reality of her in his arms. "I love you," he said again, the words muffled against her hair. "I love you so much." Julia pulled back just enough to look up at him, her face glowing with happiness despite the tears. "Kiss me," she said. "Please, Josiah. I've been waiting for you to kiss me for weeks." Josiah didn't need to be asked twice. He cupped her face gently in his large hands and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, learning the shape and taste of each other. But then Julia made a small sound of pleasure and pressed closer, her hands fisting in his buckskin shirt, and the kiss deepened. Josiah poured everything he felt into that kiss, all his love and desire and commitment, and Julia answered with her own passion, meeting him with an eagerness that made his head spin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. "We should get you back to town," he said reluctantly, "before your father comes looking for us with that shotgun he mentioned." Julia laughed, the sound breathless and joyful. "We should probably tell him we're engaged before the whole town hears about it through gossip." They walked back down the hill hand in hand, and Josiah felt like his feet barely touched the ground. At the mill, Samuel was waiting on the front step, and one look at their faces told him everything he needed to know. "I'm guessing she said yes," Samuel said, standing up with a broad smile on his face. "She said yes," Josiah confirmed, unable to keep the grin off his own face. "Then I suppose I should officially give my blessing," Samuel said. "Josiah Quinn, you have my permission to marry my daughter. And I expect you to make her happy, or you'll answer to me." "I'll spend my life making her happy," Josiah promised. Samuel pulled Julia into a hug, holding her tight. Josiah could see the older man's shoulders shaking slightly and knew he was crying. When Samuel pulled back, he wiped at his eyes unselfconsciously. "Your mother would have loved him," Samuel said to Julia. "She always said you'd know the right man when you found him, that you wouldn't settle for less than true love. She was right." Julia hugged her father again, and the three of them stood together in the gathering darkness, bound by love and commitment and hope for the future. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Word of the engagement spread through Deer Lodge like wildfire, and the town's opinion of Josiah improved dramatically now that he'd proven his intentions were honorable. The women of the town rallied around Julia, helping her plan a simple wedding and offering advice, fabric for a dress, and family recipes. Josiah used some of his saved money to buy Julia a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that the general store owner sold to him at cost after hearing it was for Julia. When he slipped it onto her finger, Julia cried and said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned. They set the wedding date for 6 weeks after the proposal, enough time to prepare but not so long that they'd drive themselves crazy with anticipation. In the meantime, Samuel began teaching Josiah the intricacies of running the mill in earnest. Josiah proved to be a quick study, his practical intelligence and careful attention to detail serving him well. The physical work was easy for him, his mountain-hardened strength making even the heaviest sacks of grain feel manageable. Julia watched her 2 favorite men work together with obvious happiness. She didn't know about her father's failing heart, didn't see the way Samuel sometimes had to stop and catch his breath, or the gray tinge that came over his skin when he overexerted himself. Josiah was vigilant, always ready to step in and take over when Samuel needed rest, doing it so smoothly that Julia never noticed. 3 weeks before the wedding, Josiah made a trip back to his cabin in the high country. He needed to close up his old life properly, to bring back his possessions and make peace with leaving. Julia understood, though she made him promise to hurry back. The cabin looked small and lonely when Josiah reached it after 2 days of hard riding. He'd built it with his own hands, every log cut and placed with care. It had been his sanctuary for years, his safe haven from the world. But as he walked through the single room, looking at his sparse possessions and the narrow bunk where he'd slept alone for so long, he felt no regret about leaving. He packed carefully, taking the things he'd need or that had sentimental value. His books, his traps, his spare clothes and weapons. He left the rest for whoever might need shelter in the future, writing a note and leaving it on the table explaining that the cabin was open to any traveler who needed it. On his way back down the mountain, he stopped at a high meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the advancing autumn. He picked the most beautiful ones he could find, wrapping them carefully to give to Julia. As he worked, he felt the weight of the mountains around him, the vast wilderness that had been his home. He was saying goodbye to more than just a cabin. He was saying goodbye to a whole way of life. But he was also saying hello to something new, a life with Julia, a life in community, a life where he wasn't alone anymore. And as the sun set over the peaks and he prepared to make camp for the night, Josiah felt peace. He was making the right choice. He knew it in his bones, deep in his soul where the truth lived. When he rode back into Deer Lodge 3 days later, Julia ran out to meet him despite the propriety that said she should wait decorously. She threw herself at him as he dismounted, and Josiah caught her easily, swinging her around before setting her on her feet and kissing her soundly. "I missed you," she said against his lips. "The bed was too empty without you." "We're not married yet," Josiah reminded her with amusement. "You're not supposed to be in my bed." "I meant metaphorically," Julia said, blushing. "Don't be crude." But she was smiling, and Josiah laughed, feeling lighter than he had in days. He gave her the wildflowers, now slightly wilted from travel but still beautiful. Julia buried her face in them and declared they were perfect. That evening, Josiah sat down with Samuel and Julia both, and they went over the mill's finances in detail. Josiah wanted to understand exactly what he was taking on, and Samuel was honest about the challenges. The mortgage payments were substantial, and grain prices could be unpredictable. Competition from larger mills in bigger towns was always a concern, but the mill was well established, had a good reputation, and with hard work could provide a solid living. "I've got some money saved," Josiah offered. From selling my pelts over the years. It's not a fortune, but it could help if we hit hard times." Samuel shook his head. "Save that for your future with Julia, for a house of your own someday, or for children when they come. The mill can support itself if we're careful." "We're going to be living here then?" Josiah asked, looking around the small quarters attached to the mill. "The three of us." Samuel and Julia exchanged glances. "For a while at least," Samuel said. "Until you can afford to build your own place, if that's all right." "It's fine," Josiah assured them. "I've lived in a one-room cabin for 12 years. This seems like a palace by comparison." Julia laughed. "Your standards for luxury are very low, mountain man." The affectionate nickname made Josiah smile. He was Julia's mountain man now, not just a mountain man. The distinction mattered. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, the aspens on the surrounding mountains blazing gold in the autumn sun. The ceremony was held in the small church, with most of Deer Lodge in attendance. Julia wore a dress of pale blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and she'd woven wildflowers into her dark hair. She looked so beautiful walking down the aisle on her father's arm that Josiah's throat closed up with emotion. Samuel placed Julia's hand in Josiah's, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Take care of her," he whispered, and Josiah nodded, unable to speak. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Josiah's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, promising to love Julia in sickness and health, in good times and bad, for as long as they both lived. Julia's voice shook slightly but rang clear as she made the same promises to him. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and told Josiah he could kiss his bride, Josiah cupped Julia's face tenderly and kissed her with all the love in his heart. The reception was held at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, which had been decorated with ribbons and more wildflowers. There was food and music and dancing, and Josiah found himself swept up in the celebration despite his natural inclination toward quietness. He danced with his new wife, holding her close and marveling that she was his now, his wife, his partner, his love. As the sun set and the party continued, Samuel pulled Josiah aside one more time. The older man looked tired but happy, his color better than it had been in weeks. "Thank you," Samuel said simply, "for loving her, for giving me peace of mind, for being the man she needed." "Thank you for raising such an extraordinary woman," Josiah replied, "and for trusting me with her." They shook hands and then on impulse embraced. It was brief but heartfelt, a moment of connection between two men who both loved Julia deeply. That night, Josiah and Julia retreated to their small room in the mill quarters, which Julia had decorated with care in preparation for this night. There were fresh linens on the bed, candles burning on the dresser, and a vase of flowers on the windowsill. Julia was nervous, Josiah could tell, but also eager, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Hello, husband," she said softly, standing by the bed. "Hello, wife," Josiah replied, his voice rough with emotion and desire. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to change her mind if she wanted to, but Julia stepped forward to meet him. They came together in a kiss that was both tender and passionate. And as Josiah carefully unlaced Julia's dress, as they learned each other's bodies with gentle hands and whispered endearments, he felt like he'd finally come home. The weeks and months that followed were a time of profound adjustment and deeper falling in love. Josiah adapted to life in town better than he'd expected, finding satisfaction in the work at the mill and in building a home with Julia. He missed the mountains sometimes, missed the vast solitude and the uninterrupted connection with nature. But whenever those feelings got strong, he'd look at Julia and remember why he'd made the choice to stay. Julia bloomed in marriage, her natural warmth and happiness evident to everyone who knew her. She loved having Josiah by her side constantly, loved the partnership they were building both in the mill and in their personal life. She taught him the finer points of the business, and he taught her more about the natural world, taking her on longer excursions into the surrounding countryside where they could be alone together. Samuel's health declined slowly but steadily through the winter. He tried to hide it, but both Josiah and Julia could see the changes. He tired more easily, his color was often poor, and he had increasing difficulty catching his breath. Julia grew worried and tried to make him rest more, but Samuel was stubborn, insisting he was fine. It was in late January, during a cold snap that sent temperatures plunging, that Samuel finally collapsed. He was working at the mill, lifting a sack of grain when his heart simply gave out. He went down hard, clutching his chest, his face gray with pain. Josiah was there instantly, catching Samuel before he hit the ground, easing him down gently. Julia screamed and ran for the doctor, but Josiah could see in Samuel's eyes that it was serious. "Tell her," Samuel gasped, gripping Josiah's arm with surprising strength. "Tell her about my heart. Tell her I knew this was coming. Don't let her blame herself." "You're going to be fine," Josiah said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't lie to a dying man," Samuel said, managing a weak smile. "Take care of her, Josiah. Love her like I know you will, and tell her I'm proud of her, so proud." The doctor arrived and confirmed what Josiah already knew. Samuel's heart had finally failed beyond repair. There was nothing to be done but make him comfortable. They moved him to his bed, and Julia sat beside him, holding his hand and crying as the life slowly left her father's eyes. Josiah stood behind Julia, his hands on her shoulders, lending her his strength. When Samuel finally took his last breath, Julia broke down completely, sobbing against Josiah's chest as he held her tight. The funeral was 3 days later, and the whole town turned out to pay their respects. Samuel Sinclair had been a good man, honest and hardworking, and he'd raised a daughter who embodied those same qualities. The minister spoke of Samuel's faith, his dedication to his family, his service to the community. Julia cried through the whole service, and Josiah never left her side, his presence a steady anchor in her grief. In the days after the funeral, Julia struggled with guilt and sorrow. Why hadn't she noticed how sick her father was? Why hadn't she made him see the doctor more often? Why hadn't she done more to help him? Josiah finally sat her down and told her the truth, that Samuel had known his heart was failing, that he'd kept it from her on purpose so she wouldn't worry, that he'd been at peace with his fate because he knew Julia would be taken care of. "He made me promise not to tell you until after," Josiah said, holding Julia's hands. "He wanted you to marry me because you loved me, not because you felt obligated for security. He wanted you to be happy, Julia. That was all he ever wanted." Julia cried some more, but there was a measure of peace in her tears now. Understanding that her father had made his choices consciously, that he'd planned for her future with care, helped ease some of the guilt she'd been carrying. "I miss him so much," she said, her voice broken. "I know," Josiah said, pulling her into his arms. "I miss him too. But he's still here in a way, in this mill he built, in the lessons he taught us, in the love he gave you. That doesn't die, Julia. That goes on." They held each other and grieved together, and slowly, the sharpness of the loss began to dull to a persistent ache that they learned to carry. Running the mill without Samuel was challenging at first, but Josiah and Julia made a good team. Josiah handled the physical labor and managed the actual grinding operations, while Julia continued to keep the books and manage customer relationships. They worked long hours, but they worked together, and there was satisfaction in building something of their own. Spring came, bringing new life to the mountains and valleys. Julia discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy of the news helped heal some of the pain of losing her father. Josiah was ecstatic but also terrified, suddenly aware of all the ways he might fail as a father. Julia laughed at his concerns and assured him he'd be wonderful. "You're patient and kind and protective," she said, her hand on her still flat belly. "You'll be an amazing father." As Julia's pregnancy progressed, Josiah became even more protective, insisting she rest more and let him handle the heavier work at the mill. Julia protested at first but eventually accepted his care with good grace, recognizing it for what it was, an expression of his love and concern. In November, a year and a month after they'd been married, Julia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel, after Julia's father, and Josiah held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," Josiah said, staring down at the tiny face, the impossibly small fingers curled around his large thumb. "Julia, he's absolutely perfect." "We made him," Julia said, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "We made a person, Josiah. Can you believe it?" Josiah couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that his life had transformed so completely in just over a year. From a lonely mountain man to a husband, father, and mill owner. From solitude to family. From surviving to truly living. Little Samuel was a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh. He had his mother's honey-colored eyes and his father's dark hair. Josiah was utterly besotted, spending every moment he could with his son, talking to him, singing to him in a rough voice that somehow soothed the baby when he was fussy. Julia watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love. This strong, capable man who could survive alone in the wilderness, who could outwork anyone in town, who could track animals and read the weather, was brought to his knees by a 7-pound infant. It was beautiful to see. The years passed, bringing both challenges and joys. The mill prospered under their careful management, and they were able to pay down the mortgage faster than expected. They had a second child, a daughter they named Grace, when Samuel was 2 years old. Grace had her father's serious nature but her mother's warmth, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect. Josiah still occasionally felt the pull of the mountains, the call of the wild places he'd left behind. But now when he felt that pull, he'd saddle up horses and take his whole family on excursions into the high country. He taught Samuel and Grace to read tracks, to identify plants and animals, to move quietly through the forest and respect the wilderness. Julia thrived on these trips, discovering in herself a love of nature that she hadn't known existed. She understood now what had drawn Josiah to the mountains, what he'd sacrificed to be with her. The knowledge made her love him even more. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Josiah and Julia climbed back up to the spot where he'd proposed, leaving the children with Mrs. Cooper for the day. They stood looking out over the valley, watching the sun set just as they had that night. "You ever regret it?" Julia asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Josiah pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "Not for a single moment," he said honestly. "That life was good, but it was incomplete. I didn't know what I was missing until I found you. You and the children, you're my whole world now. The mountains are beautiful, but they're nothing compared to you." Julia turned in his arms to face him, her eyes shining with love. "I love you, Josiah Quinn, so much more than I can ever properly express." "I love you too," Josiah said, and kissed her as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. They built a house of their own eventually, on a piece of land just outside town with a view of the mountains. It was larger than Josiah's old cabin but still modest, a comfortable home for their growing family. They kept the mill, of course, and continued to run it together, teaching Samuel and Grace the business as they grew older. When Samuel Sinclair Jr. was 16 and Grace 14, Josiah took them both on a long trip into the high country, all the way to his old cabin. It was still standing, maintained by passing trappers who'd used it as shelter over the years. The note he'd left was still there, yellowed and faded but legible. "This is where I lived before I met your mother," Josiah told his children, watching their faces as they explored the small space. "For 12 years, this was my whole world." "It's so small," Grace said, not unkindly but with wonder, "and so far from everything." "I know," Josiah said, "but it was what I needed at the time. I was hiding, I think, from the possibility of being hurt again. And then I met your mother, and I realized that hiding meant missing out on all the best parts of life. Like you too." Samuel Jr. looked at his father with new understanding. "You gave up a lot to be with us." "No," Josiah corrected gently. "I traded one good thing for something infinitely better. I gained far more than I gave up." They spent 3 days in the high country, and Josiah taught his children everything he could about wilderness survival, about tracking and hunting and reading the land. But he also talked to them about choices, about love, about how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be vulnerable enough to connect with others. On the ride back to Deer Lodge, Samuel asked his father about the day he'd met their mother. Josiah told the story about walking into the mill and seeing Julia covered in flour, glowing in the sunlight like an angel. "I fell in love with her in that moment," Josiah said, "before I even knew her name. And every day since has only made me more certain that she was the best thing that ever happened to me." Grace rode up beside them, grinning. "That's so romantic, Papa. Do you think Mama remembers it the same way?" "Why don't we ask her when we get home?" Josiah suggested. When they did, Julia laughed and confirmed the story. "I remember thinking this huge mountain man had walked into our mill and was looking at me like I'd descended from heaven instead of just made a mess with the flour. I thought he was crazy at first. But then he spoke, and his voice was so gentle and kind, and I thought maybe I was the crazy one for falling in love so fast." The children loved hearing their parents' love story, and it became a favorite tale they asked for again and again. As they grew older and began their own journeys into adulthood, they carried with them the example of their parents' love, the knowledge that sometimes the bravest choices lead to the greatest rewards. Samuel Jr. eventually took over the mill, proving to have both his grandfather's business sense and his father's strength. Grace became a teacher, fulfilling the dream her mother had once had. Both married for love, having learned from their parents that true partnership was worth waiting for. Josiah and Julia grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their family expand and flourish. The mill remained in the family, a legacy passed down through generations, and the story of the mountain man and the miller's daughter became part of the family's history, told to each new generation. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Josiah and Julia took one last trip into the mountains together. They moved more slowly now, their bodies aged and less strong than they'd once been, but their spirits were as young as ever. They made camp in a high meadow filled with wildflowers, and as the sun set, they sat together wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Julia asked, leaning against Josiah's shoulder. "She's the miller's daughter, covered in flour," Josiah quoted, his voice still strong despite his years. "She looks like an angel to me, and you did, Julia. You still do." Julia smiled, her face lined with years but still beautiful in Josiah's eyes. "And you're still my mountain man." rough around the edges but with the gentlest heart I've ever known. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. A coyote called in the distance, and an owl hooted from a nearby tree. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wildflowers and clean mountain air. "I've had a good life," Julia said softly. "The best life I could have imagined. Thank you for walking into that mill 40 years ago, Josiah Quinn. Thank you for seeing past the rough mountain man to the person underneath," Josiah replied, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, for building a life with me, for loving me all these years." They stayed in the mountains for a week that time, their last great adventure together. When they finally returned to Deer Lodge, to their house and family, they brought with them wildflowers and renewed spirits. They'd closed the circle, returning to where their story had really begun in the wilderness that had shaped Josiah, meeting the woman who had transformed him. Josiah lived to be 83 years old, Julia to 81. They died within 6 months of each other, having spent 45 years as husband and wife. The whole town turned out for their funerals, 3 generations of family and countless friends whose lives they'd touched. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking Deer Lodge, with a view of the mountains Josiah had once called home. On their shared headstone, their children had engraved a simple epitaph. He was a mountain man. She was the miller's daughter. Together they were everything. And in the mill that still operated in Deer Lodge, now run by their great-grandson, visitors could see a small framed photograph on the wall. It showed a tall, powerful man with long hair and a gentle expression, standing beside a small, lovely woman who looked up at him with clear adoration. And if you looked closely, you could see a light dusting of flour on the woman's shoulders, a reminder of the day they'd met, when a mountain man had walked into a mill and found his angel. The story of Josiah Quinn and Julia Sinclair became legend in Deer Lodge, passed down through generations as an example of true love, of sacrifice and commitment, of 2 people who chose each other against all odds and built something lasting. Children growing up in the town heard the tale and dreamed of finding a love like that. Adults told it to remind themselves that real partnership requires both people to give of themselves, to adapt, to grow together rather than apart. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light slanted through the windows of the mill just right, when flour dust hung in the air like snow, longtime residents swore they could feel the presence of the lovers who had once worked there side by side. A sense of peace and contentment, of a life well lived, and a love that had transcended even death, because some loves are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime. They ripple outward, touching everyone they encounter, creating waves of hope and inspiration that extend far beyond the original lovers. Josiah and Julia's love was like that, a beacon of light in an often harsh world. A reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the simple decision to open your heart to another person. The mountains still stood eternal around Deer Lodge, silent witnesses to the passage of time and the rise and fall of human lives. But if mountains could remember, if stone could hold memory, they would remember the mountain man who gave up solitude for love, and the miller's daughter who transformed a lonely man's life with her laughter and light. And they would remember that moment, captured forever in time, when Josiah Quinn first laid eyes on Julia Sinclair and spoke words that would echo through generations. "She's the miller's daughter covered in flour. She looks like an angel to me." It was the beginning of everything. And it was, in its own way, perfect.